Culture, the longer it needs addressed and is unmet, can have crippling effects. You could lose high quality staff. Eventually, like what we've seen in some districts too, is you lose students and families with a toxic culture.
That's Dr. Todd Dugan, superintendent of the Bunker Hill School District in Illinois, who spent 36 intentional months rebuilding culture before anything else. For him, when culture breaks down, you don't just lose momentum, you could also lose your best teachers. And that's exactly what Todd set out to prevent.
The high school building itself, there were 7 different colors of old asbestos floor tiles that had never been upkept or replaced. Lockers were banged up and old. Ceilings were stained from 1962. Some of the adults decided to just take the blades off the fan and not take the work of removing a fan and replacing the tile. It was that simple stuff like that that led this atmosphere of doing the bare minimum. And so when the adults are modeling doing the bare minimum, why would you be surprised if the kids are like, what do I need to do to get my diploma and get out of here?
In this episode, you'll learn why tolerating a neglected building normalizes low expectations, and how it affects both students and staff, and why supporting staff should never mean tolerating low standards that could drive your best teachers away. I'm Dr. Matthew Flippen, and this is Transformational Educators. How did you go about identifying the deeper systemic barriers rather than, just the isolated problems? And what was the example when you think about like a challenge, maybe on the instructional side or cultural side?
I think the cultural needs to be addressed far before the instructional. So that should be number one. Now, nobody ever gave me that on a map or a book. I've learned that through experience. You see this issue happening, but you also see this issue happening. So let's address this first, because the instruction can come, as long as it's not extremely detrimental. Culture, the longer it needs addressed and is unmet, can have crippling effects. You can lose high quality staff. Eventually, like what we've seen in some districts too, is you lose students and families with a toxic culture. So culture needs to be addressed. I do think at the end of the day, addressing those causes will eventually lead to the success of others. Conversely, you could focus everything on a symptom and you would maybe have limited success right away, short term, but long term, you'd be fighting yourself. It'd be like trying to give a car gas accelerating on the accelerator pedal when you have the emergency brake on. You have to remove that issue first in order to go forward.
Love that analogy. Is there a specific example that you're thinking about?
I will say, like any districts, test scores continues to be a push either through realtors or families or the media or even politicians. Schools are not successful, or they are successful based on a test score. And I would argue that it is more important to get a kid to come to school, to willingly come to school. Then you can address the areas that might be holding back the test scores. If you just attack the symptom, which would be the test scores itself, and that's an easy solution. If you want to have the highest test scores around, that answer is simple. Just drill the kids day in, day out on math facts or reading passages, test prep, kind of like in the book Shame of the Nation, when you talk about success for all, very low level, meaningless, drill and kill. You could have the highest test scores around. But what is that going to do for you? Are kids going to be ready for life after high school? Are they going to want to enjoy coming to school every day? Are they going to build a relationship with the school that allows them to connect at a deeper level? I mean, the whole point of schooling is to develop humans to their fullest potential. And I don't feel like the symptoms are indicative of the challenges that would be facing a child. So it does sound very holistic and whole child-centered approach. But there's definitely some truth to that. And I do feel like once you address the root symptoms of a cultural issue, the other pieces seem to be aligned. And when they're firing, the work seems easier. That makes sense. You have the right people in the right positions. They're focused on the right areas. All of a sudden, the friction and the tension disappears and it seems smooth. But it takes a while to get there.
It's easy to say it and write it out on a plan. But the execution, because people are complex and everybody has different expectations and challenges. So no, I totally get that. So how did you go about creating a culture where teachers and leaders, felt safe enough to honestly, acknowledge the challenges that maybe were impacting performance?
Well, a couple of things. They were, again, subconscious, but I've since been able to write them down and kind of look at what we want to establish in our culture. And I believe that there to be a sense of psychological safety where people can give honest feedback without fearing retaliation or things like that. So you want to have psychological safety. You also want to have an effort, a culture where people are free to collaborate, to share ideas, not necessarily be programmed on the best ideas from a speaker or a keynote or administrator, but to work and share ideas with each other. I think those two things are key. And number three is the support that is needed. I believe that you've seen it where people will say, I'm here to support you. And then sometimes that could be good and sometimes it could be bad. Like, I'm going to support you right or wrong. Well, I feel like we got to be careful there because, as a leader, everybody makes mistakes, right? So you want to support people even in a mistake once, but to know that you have a blank check of support to do whatever you want, and that you don't have to worry about that. I'm not necessarily so sure that that's the way to go. We have preached for years in our district that what you get and you can expect to receive is what you model and what you tolerate. So we make very sure to have these high expectations, to live up to them, to model them, and to accept no less. And that's the same thing that we anticipate. We anticipate getting that from our staff, our employees, but also our kids.
It's a wonderful summary, but like just the concept of creating psychological safety where there may not have been that before. That's not an easy lift.
No, it's not. You can definitely tell walls have been up from past issues, whatever they are. And I'm not saying I came to the district and it was in a bad spot. It just wasn't where I would prefer to have it. And sometimes you require a different leader for a different time. I never once came in and said, this is the right way to do it. The way you're doing it was wrong. That was another thing. You needed a leader that was focused on this strength for that time. He did what he was supposed to do, got you through that, and now passed the baton to me. I foresee a new set of challenges. So we're going to take the relay on to the next, 100 meters or whatever the relay is. But for about 3 years, we focused strictly on culture. Lots of time talking, listening, sharing, supporting, modeling. And then I made it very clear to, board, stakeholders, administrative team, et cetera, that after 36 months, the culture you're complaining about is the one that you created. You have 36 months to say it's a cultural issue. But after on month 37, that's your culture.
We have this concept that we talk about that when people come to a team or a leader goes into a new team, there's a season of culture detox, right? What the old ways, which a lot of times involve fear, hesitancy, lack of collaboration, or just openness, psychological safety, right? You've got to be in a new culture for a season. And sometimes it can be a long season depending on how harmful the previous culture was. And so the fact that you gave 36 months to that is really outstanding. I imagine during that time, you also started to see some changes in some of the outcomes that you were hoping for. Did that occur as well?
Definitely saw the outcomes as far as improved collaboration, morale, teacher retention. Those metrics did. Unfortunately, ended up being 2021 and everything shut down. So we weren't able to see the academic gains just quite yet. And then everything shut down. So there was like a brief time where everything was shut down. But I think by 2022, that was when the considerable feeling was that things were on the right track. And so it kind of lined up, although technically it was 4 years, it did line up with a 36-month expectation because we had just assumed that we had lost a year due to the pandemic.
Hey, is today's conversation resonating with you? You know, the educators we feature on this podcast all have one thing in common. They're committed to growth, not just for their students, but for themselves. At Graceland University, we've built programs and partnerships that support that kind of growth. Servant leadership and school transformation for educators who want to make a lasting difference. If you're curious about what that could look like for you, scan the QR code or check out the link in the show notes. Let's get back to the conversation. Right. I mean, I definitely think of it as a gap year. So I get that. So let's talk a little bit more on the instructional side. Was there something that you identified that maybe you thought was a challenge, but you had to dive in and uncover what was this? Was it something specific that you could address?
So there were some less than stellar assessment results, especially at the secondary level. And obviously, some of that is the tests do get harder the older the kids get. Couple that with another diagnostic symptom, which was we were losing 10% of our high school a year to private schools. On top of that, there was a general feeling of disengagement and apathy. There was frustration among the staff from this lack of motivation from the student body. However, it all began to make sense after a couple of years of taking a look at it. The high school building itself, there were 7 different colors of old asbestos floor tiles that had never been upkept or replaced. Lockers were banged up and old. Ceilings were stained from 1962. They had added an air conditioning duct and it went through where a ceiling fan was. And some of the adults decided to just take the blades off the fan and not take the work of removing a fan and replacing the tile. It was that simple stuff like that that led this atmosphere of doing the bare minimum. And so when the adults are modeling doing the bare minimum, why would you be surprised if the kids are like, what do I need to do to get my diploma and get out of here? Obviously, we had to look at some funding and in revenues to look at making some investments in a modern learning environment that would inspire student pride and well being. We also added access to rigorous college courses. We became an early college high school. We worked out a partnership with our local community college. So instead of kids being given remedial support on an online program to get the math scores up, they were actually able to and register for college math classes, which was a learning shift. And that increase in rigor, but also it was an increase in relevance because every child would say, like, when am I going to need this in real life? Well, if they're taking a college class, they very clearly know that it's a requisite for post-secondary education, whether you pursue a credential or a degree. It was basically a shift in mindset. So there's this belief that, yes, we are small and rural, but no, does not mean you need a subpar educational experience. In fact, you deserve it just as much as your urban and suburban peers. And the data backs that up too. I mean, if you look at national results, rural students outperform urban students, although they have far less resources, fiscal and human resources. They have far less resources, yet rural students outperform their urban peers. That says something about resilience and grit. And that's the thing that you really have to tap into. And that requires intrinsic motivation on behalf of the student. And I believe that that's where your culture plays the biggest part.
Yeah, Todd, thanks for mentioning those two specific examples. I've heard from more than one transformational leader that the aesthetics of the building were a key shift. That in similar, something that you don't have pride in your facility, and then you do have pride in your facility, increases not just how the students feel about it, but how the staff feel. They feel valued when they come to work in a place that is nice to be in, right? Some place that they want to be part of.
And it was strategic too, because it was, again, aimed toward elevating the student experience. And I fear that some people maybe would take that too far and then be like, okay, we're gonna paint the school and we're gonna add new vinyl tile and that's gonna raise our test scores. Then you're missing the whole connection right there between the physical environment and the student intrinsic motivation. But yes, you are right. It was necessary.
Thank you for mentioning that. I don't want anybody to think new paint equals higher scores. But I will say it's part of a formula, and that formula really starts with valuing people. And then out of that, how do we communicate?
And listening.
Listening, yeah, is so key, so key. In fact, it's really the first thing we say when you get to a new place. Please take time to listen. Let your staff be heard, and your parents and students. Yeah, and also I love how you tackled the student apathy in this creative way. There's lots of ways to try to increase student morale, but you connected it to an outcome, which is getting already into college, which I'm sure was dramatic. I know that you implemented one specific program around nursing. I'd love for you to touch on that just for a second and what that did for your community.
So that was about 4 years ago, 2022. There was a remark that I'd heard probably a couple years prior to that from a student at the high school eating lunch. And we were eating lunch together and he told me, I cannot wait to get out of here so I can start my life. And I thought, oh, that's so sad because this, what I mean? Nobody wants to wish away what you end up in hindsight being like, that was actually a pretty meaningful part of my life and it made me who I am. And here we have a kid wishing it away so they could actually start their life. So it made quite a way right away that sent a message that we need to do a better job of connecting what we're doing here as connected to the next step. Instead of saying like our job is to get you to that stage at the 12th grade and then, we did our job and go find yourself. And that was a broken model. I think that's been backed up 1,000 times, especially with the exponentially rising increase of post-secondary education, higher education. It's the value has, or the cost has gone way up. And to tell people to go out there and just take a bunch of debt and party, explore, find yourself, connect it, go find your way. It's a broken model. So we try to get kids to find their way earlier. And so that was the program. We had surveyed the kids, multiple indicators, and for 2 years in a row, we saw that the number one career choice from our high school kids was by far healthcare. St. Louis is like an hour away. Rural Illinois prepares nurses, oftentimes subsidized by state grants, and then St. Louis obtains them. So basically, South Central Illinois was preparing nurses for the St. Louis market. So we had looked into this, and so we explored a partnership with a couple of partners, our community college, Southern Illinois Healthcare Foundation, Alton Memorial Hospital. So they all kind of agreed, like SIHF said that we will pay for the scrubs and the stethoscopes. Alton Memorial said they could do free clinicals here on site. The community college dedicated a section with one of their finest instructors that had a 100% pass rate on a very rigorous exam to support that. And we even transported kids to that opportunity so that we did not want gasoline or a vehicle to be a barrier. And we did this experiment on this one career pathway, and it was remarkable. It was transformational for kids. Not to get specific, but there are certain kids that were going down a path, probably not the most productive. And this CNA nursing work-based learning experience required drug tests random. So that path had to be curtailed. Like to think we saved a kid, at least one in that regard. They also learned some of the soft skills necessary for real life success. I think they were really ticked off when they found out Columbus Day wasn't a guaranteed holiday. I mean, it's a K-12 holiday, and I think it's a federal banking holiday, but yeah, that's probably about it. You will be expected to work on Columbus Day in the real life. So there are some soft skills there, but then that sense of accomplishment when kids left with a diploma and a CNA certification, and they were already under heavy demand at Christmas time to be offered jobs making $20 an hour. Sometimes that's more than maybe one of their parents were currently making at the time. So, and we've just built upon that based on student interests and needs. It used to be education was the number 2 career pathway. Now that has dropped off the list with the education. And I think that's reflective of national trends. So now we have shifted, and based on that model, that's our new North Star for high school kids is to graduate every single kid with either 15 hours of college credit or an industry credential.
That is an incredible accomplishment. Todd, you mentioned that one story, and I thank you for, sharing that about the student that may have been on the wrong path. I mean, that it's so, important for educators to realize how they can influence the trajectory of a child's life. And the alignment of this particular initiative, I can see how that has been such a win. When you think about aspiring principals today, what advice would you give to them about, just about becoming cultural and instructional leaders? Maybe I'd speak to both of those if you could.
I do think that to be a strong instructional leader, you have to first be learner-centered. You have to remember why the whole system is even there. Every once in a while, just step back and just remind yourself why people in this town a long time ago decided to get together, share their tax money, and then send their kids. I mean, those are 2 very precious resources, your children and your tax dollars to trust them with. So you have to consider why this was all started. And it was for success for a future generation. Nobody wanted to have a community where the future generation wasn't equipped to function or be productive. So when we ask ourselves questions on why we still do something or why we're not doing something in particular, and if the answer is just sometimes it's just because of the way it is, or it's not in the job description, or no one else is doing it, so why do we have to? I've even heard other leaders say, like, trajectories of kids, that's not my job. My job is to be compliant with the state. You have to be committed. You have to be, I think, altruistic in nature. You have to want to do something, not because you would be financially rewarded, but because it's the right thing to do. And I think ultimately, when it comes to a leader there could be courses, there could be practicums and all that, but ultimately it comes down to a core characteristic of, are you transactional or are you relational and altruistic in nature? Do I think people can learn new skills? Absolutely. Leadership is a skill that can be acquired by anybody. But at the end of the day, if you're not motivated to improve the lives of learners, that's probably going to be a restraint on moving the system forward. And don't be afraid to take a risk if you can justify it with student success. District has an expression here that when we evaluate things, we run through two funnels. Can you afford it? And is it good for kids? And if it's yes and yes, it's a no-brainer. Like, I have no problem. In fact, that's about how quick our board votes on things like that. We did that pilot program 2 years ago to pay for the first 15 hours of college for every qualifying kid that wanted to access it. There's research that says kids with access to 5 classes are 22% more likely to be successful post-secondary. Higher income, higher standard of living. I think that would square up completely with the mission of a school district preparing its future community. Can we afford it? Yes. So it's a no-brainer.
And I think courage is needed is to experiment, to try to align outcomes with what's best for children.
And that goes from the boardroom down to the classroom, because if your teachers are scared to take a risk, they will stay with the tried and true worksheets that have been Xeroxed for generations. Instead, we have teachers that are taking risks by having students code little motors that will drive a car, and they're using computational thinking skills along with other interdisciplinary skills in nature, reading, deciphering, math. They're using it all together in different ways, but it requires a risk because that's not the way it's always been done. And they have to feel safe. And that's where I feel like the job of the leaders is to provide a culture and a climate that is open and conducive and supportive of risks. And I guess that's essentially what a leader does. They create the conditions for positive transformational change. So
That's
there
a
it is.
perfect definition. This perspective is so great. Great, Todd. I really appreciate you just sharing. It's not a quick fix, right? This is, and we, sometimes in our day where TikTok and 30-second videos dominate, we think, well, that was easy, but it doesn't. It takes grit and perseverance. I do think rural educators are uniquely gifted in both of those traits. And so this idea about how you transform culture, set high expectations really has been extremely helpful. So where can our listeners connect with you and just continue to learn more from you?
Twitter, tdugan75, LinkedIn.
Yeah, we'll share that on the notes, and and then we'll keep highlighting stories when we hear about the other great things you and your district are doing. Thanks really for being on the podcast today. You are.
Well, thank you for the honor of an invitation. I enjoyed it immensely.
Yes, yeah, it's really, really outstanding. So if this encouraged you as it did me, please share it with another educator or school leader who would benefit from it. If you haven't already, continue to follow Transformational Educators and keep helping schools transform into places where students and educators can thrive. If today's conversation gave you fresh insight or inspired you to lead with purpose, please follow the show and tell a friend. It helps us reach more educators who want to make a difference. For more stories, resources, and tools to support your leadership journey, visit graceland.edu. Until next time, keep leading with courage and care. If you want to keep learning about transformational strategies in education, click the next video.